I'm Janet Schneider. I'm an instructor here at the Spruill Center, and while we're on break, it's a nice time for us to present things to you that you can think about until you get back and get your hands dirty again. I'm going to talk about glazing, everybody's favorite subject. Actually, I'm not going to talk to you about the cool stuff we can do glazing. I'm going to talk to you about the stuff we need to know about glazing that will hopefully keep us from having bad outcomes. Usually, I hear about all the bad outcomes because everybody blames it on the glaze, and I mix the glazes. And truthfully, 99.9% of the time, it's user error. It is not the glaze. It's not the kilns. Sometimes it's the kiln, sometimes it's the glaze. Usually it's you. I'm going to show you some things you can do to cut down on your bad outcomes. The first one is we have 19 high fire glazes here. Nobody in his right mind is ever going to learn to use 19 glazes. It's a bad idea to wait until you have your beautiful piece and then say, geez, what should I glaze this with? I always hear, what does slate look like over amber? How do I know what it looks like? Anyway, I'm going to teach you how to make quick, easy test tiles so that you can test everything without a second thought, no waste of time, and you'll have these ready for you anytime you want. The first thing we're going to do is learn how to make a very quick, easy test tile that gives you lots of information. I'm going to make a slab. Remember when you take your clay off the block of clay that you take a long piece. Don't take handfuls and give air bubbles into it. Air bubbles are just as important when you hand build as when you throw on the wheel. Part of the reason for this is I know students hate when I ask them to test a glaze on a piece that they've spent hours making. These take less than a minute for me, probably less than 3 minutes for you. And as a result, you can have 20 of them squirreled away somewhere that you can whip out at a moment's notice, test a glaze before you put it on your piece, and be happy with the outcome. I've used paint stir sticks as my guide. I've had my block of clay. I have a rolling pin, and you can roll. You can decide how many paint sticks you need. I'm going to take this down. And there you have a slab ready to be tested. However, it's a good idea to let it sit for a little and stiffen up. And because of that, I made one a little bit earlier, not a whole lot earlier, probably half hour ago. And I'm going to use this to make my test tile. To get the most information from your test tile, it's a good idea to put a texture on it. You can do that any number of ways. You can use the sole of your shoe. You can use a wood block. This is a wood block with some rubber bands wrapped around it. You can use a stamp. You can use the bottom of a bottle. You can tell I'm pretty square. I seem to have gotten into the squares. You're going to need a piece of dry cleaning plastic. And that's about it. The first thing I'm going to do is place my object that I'm using as my form in the center. I'm going to take one of my sticks. And notice I've put this on a surface that is easy to cut on, won't do damage to the canvas here. Of course, I may not be able to cut through it either. I seem to have a splinter hanging out there. This is for the engineers. I don't measure size-wise, just to use a straight edge. And you can see how fast and easy this is. Only I could do a straight line. And nothing says this has to be a straight line. You know, I'm just doing it for the aesthetic purpose, and a lot of people like these after the fact. Then comes your dry cleaning plastic. Just rub the edges down, make them smooth. If you want to leave a rough edge, you'll get more information out of that. I tend to smooth my edges. The last thing we have to do, and then your piece is complete, is lift this, put it on a piece of foam. You might put a piece of plastic or a piece of paper or anything you want so it doesn't stick. And then you're going to put your object on here and push down. And you'll see you've made something that has a texture in the center, that has an impression, and that the sides, we're going to do this again in a second when you're not looking, and make it a little deeper. That's it for making your pieces. I'm ready now to think about glazing for real. I have my pieces that I've gotten out of the kiln room or out of my own kiln, and when I first get them out, this one's really dirty. I like to do one of several things. Usually if I just get it out and I'm not going to glaze it, I'll bring it over to the sink, I'll run it under water, I'll run water inside, I'll dump it, I'll check to make sure anything loose on it is off, and I'll put it down. If you look at this, you'll see how quickly it's drying. The truth is, it's not really drying, it's just the clay is absorbing the water. Keep that in mind because that's a really important fact. Otherwise, if my things aren't filthy and I want to glaze them now, I'll get it out of the kiln room, I'll take a damp sponge, I'll wipe it, it'll dry quickly. This one's already waxed, it's like magic. This one has lots of texture. We'll get lots of information from that one. Okay, the next step is going to be preparing the bottoms of your glazes, your pots, so that the glaze does not go down too far. As glaze fires, it melts, some of it more than others. That's one of those things you're going to learn from your test pieces. Anyway, here we have a stick that's 1/4 inch. You can rub it up against the bottoms of any of your pots and you'll see about how far you should wax. The funniest question I always get, and I think it's so cute, is when people say, I forgot to wax my pot and I already glazed it, can I wax it now? Well, the deal is there's no rule in the world that says you need to wax your pot. The deal is if you wax the bottom of your pot, it will be a whole lot easier to glaze it and keep the bottom clean. Okay, next step, waxing. Wax is wonderful and wax is awful. If you get wax on your fingers, if you get wax on your surface and don't notice it and get it on your pot, you're going to be sorry. There's always somebody who'll tell you 800 different ways to get wax off once you've gotten it on your pot by mistake. The truth is, the only sure way to do it is rebisque your pot. Or you could take it home to your stove and put it in for the cleaning section on your oven, but it's just as easy to rebisque. Anyway, if you're careful, you won't have a problem with it. I use a sponge and I put as little wax on it as possible. You'll discover pretty early on that even when you're not aware that you got wax on a piece, you got wax on a piece, and it doesn't matter how little it was, it will resist glaze. I'm going to very carefully put it on the bottom of my piece, cover down to my 1/4 inch, and notice I'm not redipping every time I turn around. In fact, I'm not redipping at all. I might squeeze my sponge slightly, but that's it. When you have something that you've thrown on the wheel, it might be easier to apply your wax and let the wheel do the work. Since we're not going to do that today, I'll just show you. I do the inside, I do the lip. And like I said, there's no rule that says you have to use wax. The one thing it'll allow you to do is get a cleaner glaze line if your hand is steady. This is really cool that I'm getting to do this and not having to look at you, because at this point everybody's eyeballs are rolling back in their heads. I don't have to see that on you. Okay. Now we're going to talk about what happens or what's different about one pot and another when you're glazing. This piece is really thin. This piece, because it was made with lumps on it, is thicker. This is thicker. This will explain some of the issues you get when Sally sitting next to you gets one look on her pot and you do exactly the same thing and yours looks different. Realize that the thinner your clay is, the less water it will absorb. As a result, you're not going to get nearly as heavy a coat of glaze on a thin piece as you're going to get on a thicker piece. Also realize that a good glaze coat is about the thickness of a postcard. If your glaze is lumpy and bumpy and thick and peeling, it's not good. I always say if it looks crappy going into the kiln, it's not going to look any better coming out. Most people don't believe me, but it really is true. Think also in terms of how much. Remember, we ran water in this pot. I would never do that on the same day that I was going to glaze the pot, unless I live in Arizona or someplace that sucks the moisture instantly out of everything you do. You might think about applying one glaze one day, waiting till the next day to put a second glaze on it. You may think, if you've used an underglaze decoration on it, to wait a day or two before you try to glaze over it. Realize that the first glaze application you put on a pot, even though it appears to dry quickly, what's happening is the glaze sits on the surface of your piece and the moisture is sucked into it, just like it did on this pot when we ran water on it. As a result, the clay itself is getting more laden with water. So the first application is going to be a thicker application than the second glaze you put on it, if all you're doing is waiting for the surface to be dry enough to touch without leaving your hand marks. If my camera will shoot in this bucket, it will see that there's about 2 inches of water sitting on that glaze. Before I stir it, I'm going to remove that water. The glaze has been sitting for a while, so it may have only separated. It's not the end of the world. But if I remove the water first and stir, and it's really thick now, I can add the water back. If I stirred it and the water's perfect right now, and the glaze is perfect right now, I'd have a really thin glaze if I had stirred it before removing the water. Notice I'm stirring all the way to the bottom. You can almost tell by looking at the surface of a glaze whether it's too thick. You can see it looks like pudding when I drag this through. I'm going to add back some of the water. It's always easy to add water. It's not so easy. Once you've stirred it, there's not much you can do until you let it settle out again. You can tell by looking at the paddle that the glaze is still too thick. I'm going to add more water back. Notice I do it in small quantities because a little bit of water goes a long way in a glaze. Okay, it's pretty uniform over the whole paddle, so I don't have a massive thickness at the bottom. If this is your own glaze at home, you obviously can keep it at whatever level you want. Since this is an art center and lots of people use these glazes, we try to keep them in the best usable condition. We also try to encourage people to wipe after themselves, but that doesn't always happen. But I'm going to be a good example. Okay, just to prove my point, which nobody ever believes, I don't know why they question me. Anyway, this has been waxed up to the 1/4 inch mark. I'm just going to dip this in here. And notice how quickly I did it. It was a fraction of a second. I'm going to let this dry, and it should dry pretty quickly. I can already see it drying along the edges. And I'm doing this, if you come prepared, when you come over here, if you bring a damp sponge with you, you can bring your piece out, rub it along your sponge, and the bottom is almost clean. Here. Okay, the bottom is clean. Okay, I'm taking a test tile. One we just, well, this one obviously we didn't just make, but this is a tile that's got texture on it. I'm going to get lots of information from this because I can dip it in a glaze. Notice the really fast dip. This is lots faster than watching paint dry. As soon as it's dry enough for me to touch it without leaving my dirty little fingerprints all over it, I'm going to dip the other end. Got it? My thumb doesn't leave a print. I'm putting it in. Realize if I overlap this, it's going to look different. If you try to match it up exactly, you'll never win. Anyway, we're going to do this. Notice I wasn't sitting here chit-chatting with my friend and leaving my arm in the bucket. Quickly dip, wipe the back off, and you let it sit. Okay, we have this piece that's really pretty dry now. It's been waiting about 5 minutes. I'm going to take one of these scrubby things that you use on your pots, and I'm going to rub the surface. Again, I'm over the bucket of glaze. You can do this over a trash can, over the bucket. Try not to inhale too much. What I'm trying to do is expose the texture. Okay, you can just see a distinct difference, and it doesn't need to be exact unless you're an engineer. And then you can take a sponge and you can do like this if that makes you happier. I kind of am happier by not doing that, but everybody's got his own taste and you can do whatever you please. But you can see if you put the effort into putting a texture on a piece, you might as well glorify it by doing something that really makes it show up. I have decisions to make about what I want to do with this. If this were mine and I were doing it purely for test, I would want to get as much information as possible out of it. As a result of that, I would probably test at least 2 other glazes on this. Put one over here, one over here. I would be trying to see, number one, what happens with this behind the glaze, what happens in the open spaces, whether the lines show, whether it runs. There's lots of information you can get by the corners where your glaze will pool. You can check along the edges because you're going to get to see how the glaze breaks on the edge of your pot. The smoother the edge, the easier it is for the glaze to adhere to it. The back's probably not going to give you tons of information, but it'll certainly give you information as to whether a glaze runs. If I put a glaze over here and a glaze here and fire them, And by the way, anytime you fire something and you don't know what the result is going to be, it's a good idea to fire it on a piece of broken kiln shelf, because then you'll have the information, and if it sticks to the kiln shelf, you'll know it really runs. Okay, I've got my piece now. I've wiped it. It's dried off a little bit. I'm going to dip it in my second glaze. Again, a really short dip. Remember, you can always dip a piece a second time if you need to. It's a lot easier to put more glaze on than to take glaze off. Okay, we've got our piece with the base glaze. We've got a second glaze, and now we're going to add a third glaze. This time I'm adding clear to it because I want you to see that even though a glaze is called clear, it's going to make a difference. And I'm going to leave a strip that doesn't have anything on it, so you'll be able to see the difference between a glaze with clear on it, a glaze with nothing else over it, and a glaze with a different glaze over it. Again, a really short dip. And now my piece is ready for firing. When you see it next, it will be finished, and you'll get to see how much information we can get from it. And we'll talk about it briefly. We've gone over the basic process of glazing a piece. There are lots of times during the process of making a piece that you should be thinking about how you're going to glaze it. You may make your piece differently depending on what glaze you want to use, whether a glaze puddles nicely, whether a glaze drips, whether a glaze doesn't drip, whether it's glossy, whether it's matte. I find it a difficult thing to listen to people talk in the studio and say, what color are you going to glaze that? We work so hard on glazes trying to get them to be so much more than color. I want you to think about all the depth of things that go on within a glaze so that you'll be able to think beyond. I'm going to make this green. I'm going to make this brown. This one's going to be blue. If you want to do that, use underglazes. That's discussion for a different day. But in the meantime, think about all the different things you can do with glaze. What we've done today is prepare you for experimenting with glazes, but knowing that no matter what you decide to do with your glazing, that you put a good application on, that you have uniformity in your application, that you have a nice coating of it, that you've stirred it well, that you've done all kinds of things to it before you've applied it to your special piece. Once you've done this, you can decide what you like and what you don't like, and you can put it on that piece that you spent hours making versus a piece that it took you 2 minutes to make. That's all for now. Once this is fired, I'll show it to you and we'll see what it looks like.